Okay, I think we're almost all here. Welcome back, everybody. I apologize for the short break because, as you all know from conferences, the breaks are the most important part. That's when you actually talk and meet and decide things. But there will be time for talking during these 2 days. So we'll try to keep the time schedule if we can. Thank you for our last speakers, our 2 speakers. And as we heard, John described sustainability as a contested concept and something that has to be reworked in a local context. And the same goes for justice. This session is called Contextualizing Just Cities. So when applying justice to an urban condition, different local interpretations of the concept will surface with different desired objectives for its realization. This session will examine what urban justice means in differing urban contexts, and how the cities within the Mistra Urban Futures network have responded to the difficulties appearing when economic development does not meet social, spatial, and economic local inequalities. So we will here look into alternative ways of realizing the just city through increased collaborations between universities, cities, and their communities. For this session, I would like to invite Dr. Rike Sitas as the moderator. Rike is a researcher from African Center for City, ACC, at the University of Cape Town. And with her research and practice, she is moving across the intersection of culture and cities. Rike's work explores the idea of an effective urbanism by looking at the role public-facing art can play in producing knowledge about the city. And linked to this, she also studies the impact of the creative economy and culture policy. A large part of this focus means unpacking the notion of public space and public life in southern cityness. At the ACC, Rike is also the Cape Town LIP coordinator for Mistra Urban Futures, which also involves coordinating other platforms and knowledge spaces such as urbanafrica.net, the City Alliance think tank, and Public Art and the Power of Place. Very welcome, Rike, and please bring with you your panel of Warren Smith, George Mark Onyango, and Carina Listerborn.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Henrietta. So I'm going to start by just giving a very short framing of the session that we're going to unpack today before introducing the speakers, and then we'll go through a set of prepared responses, but then also try and generate a little bit more of a deeper discussion around co-production and around the relationship to the just city. So, I mean, as Henrietta mentioned, that there is that, you know, even though the notion of the just city is permeating urban visions across the world, there's still disjunctures of how this is understood, and how we can see that the economic development is not necessarily trickling down adequately enough to address social, spatial, and economic inequalities. And this has been a consideration for scholars for centuries. People have been writing about justice and issues around injustice for quite a long time. The kind of appalling living conditions that came hand in hand with urbanization have ranged a wide range of accounts from the 1800s onwards, from Friedrich Engels to John Stuart Mill and David Harvey, who all drew on concepts of social and distributive justice. And then David Harvey also spoke then about spatializing it in terms of territorial justice. In the 80s, Gordon Perry framed it as spatial justice, which was then popularized by Edward Soja. And subsequently, the environmental justice has been also inserted into the debate. And so the articulations of just cities have been closely linked to the notion of the right to the city, which has also found great traction in the southern literature. The way Lefebvre saw it, the right to the city, was having 2 key dimensions: the right to participate in decision-making and the right to appropriation, that is to physically access, occupy, and use urban space, thus emphasizing social value of space and its, more than its in space of its economic value. So, and the concept of the right to the city has come to the fore in global agendas, as we can see as the negotiations around the new urban agenda leading up to Habitat 3. But the most comprehensive exploration has been in Susan Feinstein's book in 2010 called The Just City. And although this was focusing heavily on the global north, the definition of injustice is maybe helpful in this context. For her, injustice can be seen as actions that disadvantage those who already have less or are excluded from entitlements enjoyed by others and who are no more deserving. And so there's this extensive growing literature around the just city, but there are also lots of different stakeholders who are using the terms in different ways, from states to advocacy groups, from cities to social movements. And so although there is a general recognition that fair and equitable and just cities are important, there may not always be consensus about how the language, how the words are used, what they mean, or how this is realized in practice. And so what we're going to do today is get 3 responses from 3 of the Mistra Urban Futures cities, and to unpack this a little bit further. So we'll start. Let's start with the first question that we asked. Yeah. Oh, do I have? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so we've had that. So how can just cities be realized through increased collaboration between universities, local governments, civil society, and residents? So to talk to these issues, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have Warren Smith, who is the Cape Town LIP Director and Research Manager at the African Centre for Cities, which is based at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Smith's research involves around urban planning, urban management in cities of the global south, urban policy discourses, such as how ideas emerge, are adopted and adapted and used to construct problems and solutions, and then turned into policies and practices. An important strand is how to create policy-relevant knowledge around understanding and achieving more equitable cities and urban governance. So interested in how decisions are made and the relation of this to institutional structures and policies. Thereafter, we'll have George Onyango, who's a professor at the School of Planning and Architecture at Maseno University. Prof. Onyango is trained as a planner with years of experience in facilitating community participation in urban and rural development. He's worked with various various organizations across Africa in facilitating development research interventions and building institutional capacities in a wide range of planning and development sectors. Prof. Onyango has extensive experience in both qualitative and quantitative approaches in community and institutional interventions, in strategic and spatial planning, monitoring and evaluation. And as a professional, he's been actively engaged in building the knowledge and skills base of many development practitioners within and outside the university environment. So an amazing link between both university and practice. And Karina Listerborn is a professor at the Department of Urban Studies in Malmö University, and Prof. Listerborn finished her PhD here in Chalmers in Göteborg on urban safety and safety planning from a feminist perspective. Her research fields include urban social geography and social urban sustainability and gender studies. She's part of the Strong Research Environment CRUSH, Critical Urban Sustainability Hub, which is a national research network who put the housing question in the center of sustainability issues. She has previously done research on urban conflicts and uprisings, neoliberal planning, and is right now focusing on housing from below and housing inequalities. So really looking forward to all 3 of these responses. So I'd like to start with Warren, if you can.
So we were only allowed to choose 1 photo, and this is the photo I chose. So this is the city that Rick and I come from, Cape Town. It's the 2nd largest city in South Africa. It's got about 4 million inhabitants. And this is a view of the central part of Cape Town, the central business district, taken from the site of District 6, so District 6 used to be the most densest and vibrant part of Cape Town. It was a largely poor, racially mixed area that grew up in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But then, as part of the apartheid era forced removals during the 1960s, about 55,000 people were forcibly relocated from the area of District 6. All the buildings and houses in the area were razed, and the residents were forcibly moved to new housing estates on the periphery of Cape Town. And then the vacant site that was declared as a residential area for white people only. However, most of the site was never ever redeveloped, so the area is still largely vacant. And this is probably one of the most tangible and visible reminders of injustice and inequity in Cape Town, and very clearly shows that Cape Town was a very unjust city, and to a large extent still remains a very unjust city. And all the statistical figures kind of back that up. So showing that Cape Town is one of the most unequal cities in the world. So Gini coefficients are typically used to measure inequality, with 1 being the most unequal and 0 being perfect equality, and with about 0.4, above 0.4 being regarded as being dangerous levels of inequality. So Cape Town has a income Gini coefficient of 0.69. So this is lower than the income Gini coefficients of other South African cities, but it's still higher than any other non-South African city anywhere in the world. And South African cities also have very unjust spatial forms. So during the apartheid period, from the 1950s to the 1980s, South African cities were deliberately planned to be segregated by race and class, with poor black people largely located on the edges of cities, quite far from job opportunities and all the various other social and economic opportunities that one associates with cities. And South African cities still largely reflect these spatial patterns, although there have been some attempts to overcome them. Have been quite ineffective. So how can cities such as Cape Town be made more just? So Ricker was talking about some of the ideas about what a just city is, and Susan Feinstein, in her book, The Just City, says that one of the key ways is about trying to achieve a just city through ensuring that all people's interests are represented in decision-making processes, so that policies and strategies and projects don't just reflect the views of the dominant elite, but reflects a much broader sort of spectrum of views. So one important approach is participatory processes, such as participatory planning and participatory budgeting at local scale and at citywide scale, to ensure that a greater range of interests are fairly represented in decision-making. But another important way is trying to achieve policies and strategies and projects that, through local governments and civil society and residents and universities, sort of collaboratively co-producing the knowledge that drives these policies and strategies, and actually through co-producing the actual policies and so on themselves, and trying to get policies and strategies and projects that reflect a range of perspectives and are much more holistic and much more context-specific, or basically knowledge co-production, as it's going to be called within Mistra Urban Futures. So at the Mistra Urban Futures Cape Town Local Interaction Platform, which is anchored at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town, we've been attempting since 2008 to try and contribute to realizing a more just city through various knowledge co-production processes, of trying to work together with local government and provincial government and civil society and residents to try and produce policy-relevant knowledge and to work on co-producing policies that better reflect the context that we live in. So we initiated our City Lab program in 2008 to try and deal with real issues and overcome the divides between policy and practice and the divides between different disciplines. So our City Labs try to build communities of knowledge and practice by bringing together academics and government officials and civil society and students in meetings and workshops and field visits to ensure that participants are exposed to a range of different perspectives, and they can build networks across different sectors, try to integrate different types of knowledge, academic knowledge, practical knowledge, knowledge from different disciplines and sectors, through seminar series, through collaborative publications that reflect a range of different views and perspectives. And then we also try to do collaborative interdisciplinary research projects that cut across different sectors and involved practitioners and researchers working together. And then in 2012, we started our knowledge transfer program as part of Mistra Urban Futures, which was a more systematic way of trying to bridge the policy practice divide by embedding researchers within the city of Cape Town, 4 of them for 3 years each, and then bringing officials from the city, 6 per year for 2 months each, to reflect on the policies and practices they were involved in to try and overcome this policy practice divide. And I think through these co-production processes, we've been able to produce policy relevant knowledge. We've been able to directly input into policies, resulting in policies that represent a much more diverse range of views, and not just the dominant perspectives and the assumptions of the elite who usually control these processes. And it's resulted in policies that we think that are more pro-poor. It should be noted, of course, that co-production is very difficult. Different partners do have these different agendas. There are usually very severe power imbalances. But essentially, there's no option. We have to try and find new ways of co-producing knowledge and co-producing policies that better reflect the cities we live in and which can better contribute to changing the cities to make them more just.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Warren. Can I ask George to please give us his reflection now?
Yeah. Here's a picture that shows the boundary of the new and the old city. This road actually runs on the boundary of the old city boundary, which was 1972. On the right, you have the outer part of the city. On the left, you have the inner part of the city. This is a reflection of the colonial history that we have in Kisumu, where Kisumu city was reserved for the colonial administrators, and the people who were authorized to work in the town, they required a gate pass that they could be able to get into town. And those who had families, therefore, brought their families and established homesteads outside the city boundary, and that's on the right. And these homesteads over time grew into this big slum belt around the city, housing more than 60% of the population of that particular city, with poor infrastructure, poor services, and little integration in the city planning process. I thought this picture would then reflect the unjust nature of that city's development and give a basis for understanding what we are doing within the Kisumu Local Interaction Platform. The Kisumu Local Interaction Platform is building on experiences that were started earlier on when we had what we call the Kisumu Action Team that had a combination of people in the academia, we had people in practice, we had people in policy, in the private sector, all working together to create a new city that was all-inclusive. And then in 2010, we had a new constitution in Kenya that created counties, and the county government came in and, fortunately for us, picked on some of those activities that we had been undertaking in Kisumu Action Team, and has been strengthened by the activities of the Local Interaction Platform, the CLIP. The Kisumu Local Interaction Platform has basically been operating with 2 pilot projects in which we have students who are at the PhD level, we have researchers, then you have policymakers from the county government and policymakers from the city management. You have people from the private sector and other public institutions all working together to co-create knowledge. We believe that this has enabled the students not only to have research that is relevant to themselves, but also relevant to the aspirations of the city, because the findings from their research then gets transferred into policy. We have been able to develop policy initiatives, especially with regards to waste management and market places and ecotourism, which are then being integrated into some of the policy interventions within the city. The most important thing here is that the county government has been very supportive in terms of participating, because you might find that in certain areas you want to involve the public sector, but they don't want to be part of it. And I think a proof of it is our county governor is here in this particular hall, showing the commitment. The former mayor of Kisumu is here. So all those people are big players in this particular process. The fact that 60% of the population is living on the right-hand side of the city is, to us, very critical, because that is basically the majority of the city that is then disenfranchised. And our challenge then is how to make sure that they are part and parcel of this process of contextualizing the city, where everybody has a stake in the city and everybody benefits from the staying in that particular city. Thank you.
Great, thank you, George. Karina?
Yes. Well, just as we discussed in the previous session, I think that it's very important that we talk about that justice is clearly something that will be organized by itself, and especially not in times of a very strong market-driven economy. And I also think it's very important that we dare to talk about power relations that underlie the structures of distribution. We can't just talk about justice without talking about power. And with power comes resistance and contestations. And as Foucault formulated, where there's power, there's resistance. To build coalitions are very important, of course, but so is the possibilities for resistance and contestations. And that's because cities are constantly changing, being transformed physically and socially due to urbanization, migration, other forms of societal changes. And there is no end point of success. And I also think the whole idea of success stories or best practices are quite problematic because they tend to sort of fix time and space to a certain point, while things are actually constantly in change. I want to illustrate my argument through a more historical perspective and through the example of the Swedish Union of Tenants, which is I think in the international context, is a rather unique phenomenon. And I also understand housing to be one of the core questions of the just city. I mean, it really relates to issues of the individual perspective, the home, but also socially, economically, and also environmentally. So this picture of an evicted family in Stockholm in 1910 illustrates a situation on the housing market in Sweden in the beginning of the 20th century in the major cities in Sweden. So the migration from the countryside, intense urbanization in combination with housing shortage led to an acute housing situation. The housing standards were extremely poor. The houses were cold, there was drafts, there was pests, and they were very expensive. And during the World Wars, very few houses were built for the working classes, and the rent increases then as a consequence of that. So this constant threat of evictions, the poor standards, and the unreasonably high rents led to rent strikes in many cities around Sweden. The landlords, on the other hand, then answered with blocking people out, so they actually had to be put on the street. So these fights increased, and the tenants' union were established in several cities. And the first one in Sweden was established in Nynäshamn, south of Stockholm, in 1915, where workers at the national telecompany organized themselves and put pressure on their landlords. Already in 1917, the national government realized they had to support the tenants, the workers, and the first law against eviction due to unreasonable rent increases were introduced. This law, however, was abolished already in 1923, and a lot of the so-called troublemakers were then immediately evicted by the landlords. So the fight was obviously not over. In the 1920s and 30s, the tenants' union grew larger, got more organized, and also gained much more support from the then social democratic government. Not the least from the famous couple working at the universities, Alva and Gunnar Myrdal. So this whole process led to new housing politics, to new housing policies in the 1940s. Rents became regulated, and the union of tenants became the instance of control. But already in the 1950s, the rent regulation were abolished for public housing, and also later then for private landlords. And instead, a system of negotiation were established between the public housing companies and the union of tenants. And then the rent levels were set on use value negotiated by these two parts. And I don't intend to go into all the details of this, but I think it's an illustration of how the union of tenants, based on urban constatations, conflicts, became a very important player in the development of an increased housing standard in Sweden. In the late 1970s, there was hardly any housing shortage, and only 5% of the population were then living in overcrowded flats. And the legal support for tenants were very, very strong. The union became institutionalized and got a lot of political power and economic power. But in the 1990s, again, the neoliberal political winds turned housing into to private property. They were either sold out or they turned into private property. And market rents were vividly discussed, and the union became a hinder for the market to grow, and the private landlords took the case to EU to question the right to influence the rent levels. So again, we saw a rise of poor housing standards due to lack of renovations, higher costs, and less built houses. And the whole housing crisis in the beginning of the 21st century emerged. So young people, migrants, single parents, elderly, many groups today find it very, very difficult to find housing in Sweden, especially in the big cities. And the private market are still pushing for market rents. And this is quite ironic because we actually do have market rents on the second-hand market, because there's no limit to the prices you can charge for a flat since 2013. So where does this leave us today? Well, we see new social movements emerging based on the housing situation. They are growing in many big cities in Sweden. Many of them act outside the union of tenants because they feel that their influence is not strong enough, or because they feel that they are too slow, or because they are too institutionalized. So this story, I think, tells about collaboration between universities, local governments, civil society, and residents, but also about urban contestations and collaborations as an ongoing process where new power relations emerge along the way. And the tenets of union came out of strikes, political fights, but became a partner to governments and academics. And today, new social movements rise as contestations and collaborations somehow hang together. So that's the perspective I want to add to this.
Great, thank you. As all three of you are speaking, it really struck me that there are three themes that seem to be quite similar across the three contexts, and that is around housing, it's around shifting power politics and policies, and this vastly unequal cities based on kind of new and old forms of economic elites. So you can see that there are definitely similarities across the cities, but what struck me, we have already started doing some comparative research as part of the Mistra Urban Futures program, is that although there might be similar issues, there may not be a similar language of how justice is being spoken about. So before we get into the issues, I was hoping just to get a reflection from each of the contexts around how social justice, or how justice is being spoken about, or if it is and where it is, and what is the kind of language that goes with this. George, would you like to start this time?
Yeah, thank you. This has been a contentious issue in the city of Kisumu because of the structure of management of the city. The new constitution requires that the city has a city management board, and the city management board then reports to the county government. And the same constitution also gives provision for legislation that facilitates these processes. And one of the key aspects is community participation. Community participation in decision making, community participation in monitoring interventions, and so on. But the drivers of this particular community participation are politicians. And politicians have their own political stakes, and that can sometimes derail the community aspirations. Because if the community aspirations and the politicians' aspirations are not in congruence, then you find that you're not talking the same language. Yet, the same law can then enable the citizens to stop certain interventions that are being done which they did not participate in. And that has actually become one of the key driving forces in urban development in Kenya at the moment, where communities are beginning to become strong and able to realize what their roles and what their function is in terms of ensuring that they are participating in decision making and in making changes in terms of cities development. We recently completed development of an integrated strategic urban development plan, and the whole process of developing that plan had particular stages where if there was no community participation, the plan would become null and void. So the fact that we have a legal framework for that community participation, I think then strengthens the possibilities of inclusion and possibilities of having social justice. But the yokes of historical injustices makes some of these citizens to the right of the city that I was talking about feel disempowered in terms of coming out to speak out certain things, because issues of social standing, issues of capacity to be able to mobilize themselves, issues of being able to identify those key areas that they think they need real changes. Because as we have a saying, you live in a particular environment and you get used to it and you find that that is the norm. So you require a little bit of a push to make you begin to see that there's possibilities of creating change, so that we can have the people who live in those slum areas as being part and parcel of the city, so that we have slums of hope rather than slums of despair.
Thank you. Can I pass the question over to you?
Yes, I think in the context in Swedish planning, of course, it's very much related to issues of democracy and participation. But I think that maybe we need to be aware of that the concept of justice is sometimes emptied of its meaning, becoming rather depoliticized. And when you talk about justice, it's often something that should sort of happen in certain areas, like the poorer neighborhoods, while sort of the richer areas are often left out of this discussion. So I think that's a problem. I mean, who is concerned about with the concept of justice? I also think it's a problem when people do raise their voices in certain areas. they are not really listened to. They're more regarded as a problem and as something that needs to be dealt with by policing. So I think that we don't really have a consensus about what justice is, and I think that's one thing that we need to discuss, what do we actually mean, and maybe also starting to talk about what are the injustices. I think you mentioned that in the beginning. I think it's very important. What do we mean by injustice? And that we dare to talk about the power relations that underlies it.
Thank you. Warren?
So I think South African cities are always very segregated in terms of race and class. So often, when you talk about justice and moving towards a more just cities, it's often use the concept of integration, of trying to integrate different races, integrate different classes, try and make South African cities denser and more compact and more integrated. Obviously, there are enormous obstacles to that. There's often a perception that there's a lack of political will amongst key decision makers to make major changes to the status quo. We've been working with local government and provincial government around these issues. We're also going to be working much more in the future with civil society as well, but trying to, in particular, look at key vacant pieces of open land and what to do with them to try and implement really catalytic projects that do have a radical impact on the nature of the city and trying to make it a more integrated and just city.
Thanks, Warren. So, in a sense, that there seem to be these shared concerns around justice, but not necessarily a very defined language around what justice means. And I think your point was really interesting about what are the injustices. So, my next question would be, in the different contexts, what would be the key issues of injustice that need to be dealt with in the pursuit of realizing more just cities? Let's start with you.
Well, I think that will certainly be quite common in many ways, even though it may look different in different contexts. I think, of course, it's a lack of influence for certain groups. It's about the distribution of resources. It's about economic injustices. It's about the housing, which is like more and more groups are really excluded from the housing market. They have to turn to second-hand market, which are extremely expensive and insecure. And there's a lot of, the economy looks very similar in the whole world, and it seems like it's something that we don't really question. The truth of how much it costs to build a new building, for example, is something a lot of people don't dare to ask. Is that really so? Could it not be different? And this question of asking, could it not be different, I think, is something that is not very often raised, actually. It's also this, in a lot of societies, segregation are growing, the prejudices amongst certain groups are increasing. We see populism all growing in large parts of the world, which is highly problematic and really threatening justice and democracy in many ways.
Great, thank you. Warren?
So I think it's probably quite similar. So economic injustice is obviously like the major thing that permeates through every aspect of people's lives. We've got a very, very high rate of unemployment and very high rates of poverty and very high rates of income inequality. I think the spatial form, especially in the South African cities, because they were planned to be segregated and inequitable, I think the spatial form is quite a big issue. With poor people largely located on the periphery of cities, and also South African cities like Cape Town have got very poorly functioning public transport systems, so it's really difficult to get around the whole city. And also I think similarly housing is a big, access to housing is quite a big dimension of inequality. So we've got over 100,000 households in Cape Town living in informal settlements without adequate access to shelter and services and tenure.
Thanks. George?
I think it's an issue of access and control, because most tenants who are disenfranchised are basically living in those unplanned areas. They have access to housing. But the landlords who control the issues of housing, the type of housing, the facilities they have, don't live in those particular locations. So they don't really feel the pressure to provide services, because to them it's basically a source of income. And so when you're trying to mobilize to create a change, who do you mobilize, the tenants or the owners of the property? Because the owners of the property are the ones who can basically be able to make a decision about relocation, reconstruction, if we need to provide way leaves and so on. They're the ones who have to cede the land. And the tenants can only complain about the kind of services they're being provided with. And so that's basically a tenant-landlord relationship. And that then becomes very difficult to negotiate in the overall structure of trying to create social justice within the city. I think that's basically what it boils down to.
Okay, thank you. I think, it really came out strongly that there's the kind of economic injustice, but then also, especially in the context of cities that were divided by colonialism, with this very long heritage of colonialism and apartheid, where there's the spatial dimension to injustice as well, which become very difficult to address. It's interesting that in the previous session there was a lot more focus on the environment and on environmental concerns and climate concerns, yet the focus largely in this discussion so far, justice has been located around housing and economic injustice. So I'm not sure if anybody would like to reflect on that as an interesting observation.
Well, of course, I think they hang together, but I think that environmental issues, if we don't sort out the other issues, we don't have a society to work around anyway. So I think it's really bottom line, the social aspects actually. And I also I talked to a planner once in Malmö who asked him, why don't you focus on the neighborhoods that are sort of consuming the most energy in our part of the city, instead of just focusing on the poor neighborhoods. And I said, yeah, but the rich neighborhoods you can't do anything about. They do as they want anyway. So I think we do have a problem also, relation between the social and the environmental issues.
Does anybody else want to?
Yeah, I think there is a big, environmental injustices kind of go hand in hand with a lot of the spatial injustices. So often people who are living in informal settlements are exposed to the hazards such as flooding and fires and so on, and are probably most exposed to polluted environments that they're living. So yeah, you can't really separate out the environmental injustices from the various spatial injustices of how cities are laid out and the differences between different types of neighborhoods.
And I think you'd also find that the authorities that are in charge of controlling environmental issues tend to focus on the planned areas of the city. They're able to access them easily. They're able to get those particular persons. They're able to address them. They can be able to take them to court. But in the unplanned settlements, you don't know who you're going to be dealing with. Are you dealing with the people who are squatting on that piece of land? Are you dealing with the landlords? Are you dealing with the tenants? And so the environmental concerns then in those areas where you have those injustices then tend to be compounded, I believe.
Thank you. And so when we were, kind of returning to the first question slightly as well, is within all of these, we started reflecting on the relationship with universities and addressing social justice or spatial justice or just cities in general. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of co-production in realizing the just city and practically working towards addressing injustice. George, would you like to start?
Yes. The universities have a key role in terms of training manpower. But most African universities tend to find a scenario where the universities are there and the students come to the universities. There's very little proactive kind of activities from the university to stimulate getting people who are not necessarily researchers in the university in terms of co-production. And that's the experiment we've tried in Kisumu, and it seemed to have worked because Maseno University then is involved actively in the planning and development of the city of Kisumu. They're involved in all the major committees that are creating changes. They're involved in mobilizing communities in terms of interventions and so on. So you actually see that the university can be mobilized with a focus towards creating change. And it's even better when you have a whole team of universities working together. And that has been also something that we've been able to do for the last couple of years. We have 2 local universities, and then we have a partnership with Chalmers and Gothenburg University. So we have 4 universities working with the city of Kisumu, trying to create innovations and change. And so you can have university driving change from that kind of partnership rather than the traditional ivory tower, where you write papers and hope that one day someone will be able to read them and implement them.
Thanks. Warren?
I think co-production is crucial. So we've been at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. We've been involved in co-production in Cape Town with government, provincial governments, local government, civil society, and residents and private sector organizations for the last 8 years, since 2008. And I think universities do have a very important role to play within the co-production process, because it's basically can play a role of mediating and facilitating between the different interests and stakeholders. Because it's often seen as being a neutral venue. So often when we have meetings at the university, it's kind of seen by government officials and civil society people and so on as kind of a neutral place where they can interact in a different kind of way than they would be able to in the more formal spaces, say if it was at the local government offices or somewhere. And I think also university academics have quite an important role to play in validating the different types of knowledges, because in co-production processes, it's about trying to integrate different types of knowledge that different stakeholders have about a particular topic. And it's kind of important to have some sort of academic rigor as to how those knowledges are assessed and validated and incorporated together. So I think there university academics have an important role to play. And also co-production always, on paper it looks like a very neat and simple way, but in practice it's often a very messy and conflicted way. So it's also important for the academics facilitating those processes to have some type of facilitation skills to be able to deal with conflict and messiness and those different interests.
Thanks, Karina.
I think, first of all, it's not really a new thing. I think that, as this example showed as well with the Swedish Union tenants. I think there's something that been going on, and if you think about the Right to the City movement, it was very much driven by the students and by the universities. So in that sense, I think that universities are quite good at picking up what's going on in society and are, looking outside. Maybe not all universities, but I do think a lot of universities are. And through the students, we also constantly contact with what's important and contemporary issues. But then I think the problem more comes to implementation of certain policies or whatever is going to be implemented. I think that's when you realize that there are different cultures and different authorities and organizations and workplaces, which can be quite difficult to get around. And it's also a question on whose term is it going to be, who's going to be the one who rules. And quite often we tend to talk in terms of we, and we also have to ask who are we representing? Is it in our own interest to develop our own organization, or is it in some other interest? There's a lot of tricky things there with co-production, but I also think we can learn from the history. We don't have to invent the wheel all the time. There are things to build on as well.
I think what's very interesting to have this idea of conflict and dissensus raised as well. So I was wondering, we'll hear a lot more about co-production in the following sessions, having reflections on some of the work that's happened. But in terms of defining the just city and trying to work out how to realize just cities, I was wondering whether each of you could talk a little bit more about the competing notions of justice within particular contexts. So you might have cities viewing justice in a particular way, or social movements viewing justice in a particular way. And if you could maybe just reflect a little bit on how that plays out, also within a moment of co-production that Warren was mentioning, where universities are having to mediate these sometimes seemingly irreconcilable logics. Warren, would you like to start?
So I think in South Africa it's maybe different to the other contexts, because there's been quite a long established acceptance that there is a need for transformation and to try and turn our very unjust cities that we live in to more just cities. So kind of everybody has the same terminology about what needs to happen. And long lists about inclusivity and equality and integration and so on. I think in practice, it tends to be a division between those who want the more radical sort of agenda to change things dramatically, and then those often the ones who are in power who want to not necessarily oppose to move in that direction, but want to do it very slowly and carefully without sort of upsetting the status quo. So I think in all of the processes one is involved in, one kind of is dealing with essentially those two divisions. Obviously it's not a binary, it's like a continuum, but there's that between those who want to move very slowly and those who want to make major changes. So often that's a balancing act we have to we have to sort of deal with in the work that we do, because often we would be working with, say, civil society groups who've got quite a radical agenda, and we'd be working, say, with local government who doesn't want to upset too many of their constituents. And yeah, I mean, I think essentially that is what the essence of co-production is, of trying to make sure that you are pulling together, that you try and identify what are the overlaps in interest between different parties. Because there will be some overlaps, but there will also be some quite, some positions that are unable to be overlapped. So I think it's quite also important in co-production processes to identify who are the people who need to be around the table, trying to get them around the table, and then trying to identify what is your common agenda that you want to deal with.
Thanks.
I think it's something about whose reality we are addressing. And we have political cycles of 5 years. So politicians have to deliver within 5 years. And so they have a very different kind of agenda in terms of getting that notion about justice and inclusivity and so on. And the results must be seen before the next cycle of elections. Citizens tend to think of longer term kind of interventions, things that would be sustainable, that would be there even after the politicians are gone and so on. And that's basically the divide that we're having. And as I said earlier on, the fact that we have a legal framework helps the citizens in terms of driving this particular agenda. The only challenge is how you can be able to accommodate that within the political aspirations, because at the end of the day, it's the politicians who do the ruling. And they're the ones who drive most of the agenda. They're the ones who have the resources. So how do we have that process of inclusivity? And that's why I think this co-production of knowledge, in which you involve the politicians and involve the policymakers at this early stage, so that everybody's on the same level of understanding in terms of what is being done, is documented, then it's driven forward, becomes quite instructive. And universities, unlike politicians, live a bit longer. They think they have a lifespan longer than 5 years. So the fact that they are driving that agenda as part of this co-production is a strength that I think we can be able to build on, because they'll have the institutional knowledge. They can be able to move from one political regime to the next political regime and be able to transfer that agenda. And they also live within the community because they are part and parcel of that community, so they're able to understand and be able to incorporate that agenda. And the fact that you have, at least in Kenya, we have a very strong civil society that has this term we call capacity building. Their capacities have been built beyond a reasonable doubt. So these capacitated civil society organizations and community groups, I think, have been also at the forefront in terms of this co-production. And the fact that we've involved them in this process is quite instructive, because then they'll go back to the agenda, but the agenda is also informed by this interactive process.
Thanks, Karina.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. Of course, it's a highly political question. I mean, whether you believe that justice should be organized through equal distribution or whether it should be based on charity. I mean, that's two totally different political positions. I also agree that, in people's mind, it's a much longer process than just the period where the political parties are ruling. I think, in the question of housing, for example, is a good example in Sweden, because the problem, at least in Stockholm, was very obvious already in the 90s, but it took like 30 years before the politicians to realize this is a hot political issue. So that's also something which is quite interesting, because it comes very slowly to the political agenda, these things that people have experienced for a long time. So I also think that's very important to be a bit more aware of what's going on in society from the political point of view.
Great, thank you. I know we're moving quite rapidly towards lunch, but I wanted to open it up to see if there are any questions from the audience. And one of the purposes of these, one of the outcomes of these sessions is also to try and figure out a burning question to take onto the next, into the discussion session. So if you can also think about what your burning question might be while we look for any audience questions.
Yes, my name is Camilo Calderon. I'm a researcher from the Department of Urban and Rural Development at SLU in Uppsala. Thank you for a very interesting conversation among you. One of the things that I'm interested in my research is to try to find out which contextual aspects or which contextual factors facilitate the kind of collaborative or co-productive initiatives and processes that you're talking about. And I think all of you touched a little bit on while presenting the cases of your process or how it works in your context. And I'm particularly interested in that because Warren, you said something that, I mean, this kind of processes are very difficult. There are different agendas, there are power imbalances, but there is no option. We need to do that. So I'm curious into which contextual factors would facilitate, or based on your experience, would facilitate these processes, and what do we do in contexts where these do not exist, or these are not at place?
Who would like to respond? Warren?
Oh, okay, yeah. I think probably in our context in Cape Town, probably the key one was the fact that government realized that things weren't working, that they had to do things differently, that they couldn't just do the normal policy-making processes because they weren't having any real impact on changing things in the city. So I think that was probably the key thing, that's the fact that when we were first set up, that government officials were coming to us wanting help to try and get policy processes sort of initiated and wanted to try and get different views incorporated in policy-making processes and wanted our assistance with trying to understand issues in a different way. And so I think that was probably the thing that made co-production be able to work in our context, because the other stakeholders like civil society we already had relationships with and they wanted to work with us and they wanted to change things. But I think in order for co-production to work, in order to have a real impact on policies and that, you need to have some sort of buy-in from government bodies. And we also found that the state is never a monolithic entity. It's like a fragmented, infinite different little fragments with different departments and units and sections often having very different, often very conflicting views. So often within the state, it's possible to find particular sections or departments or individuals who one can work with. And sometimes your views might be quite different to the views of other sections and departments and units of the state. But essentially having some sort of foothold within government bodies is quite important for co-production processes, because ultimately you want to be able to impact on government policies and programs. And you can't really do that if the government is like completely opposed to being involved in co-production.
Does anyone else want to respond? Karina?
Yeah, I think one context, for example, when it comes to housing, when it became a problem on the political agenda was very much when the private sector couldn't find people to employ because there was no flats for people to live, like in Stockholm. I also think, for example, the context of segregation, it becomes a problem when more cars are burning and when we see more shootings in the city, then it becomes an issue. So it really has to be a public concern before. I think that's the kind of contextualization that we see in Sweden, at least.
I think in our context, it's the changing political circumstances. We have had a whole new constitution. We have a devolved system of government, and we are devolving so many functions very rapidly with very little human resources. So the county government, with the challenges in terms of human resources, find it easy then to work with the universities because the universities have been there in terms of building human resources and so on. So it made it easy to get a buy-in for the purposes of co-production and then working in the other different sectors.
Thank you. We've got 1 more minute before we're going to close for lunch. So I thought that maybe the one way to wrap this up would be to think about the kind of burning question. Of our session was really focusing on understanding and contextualizing just cities. So can we do, as a way of conclusion, a last comment from each of you, maybe posing one question that could help us develop the idea of contextualizing just cities. Thanks. Who would like to start?
Well, I can
Karina.
try.
Okay.
Well, I think that one thing that we have talked about here, and which is quite important, is that justice can't be an empty concept. It has to be filled with meaning, and we have to realize it's not the same for everybody. And so I think that maybe one question would be, what kind of injustices do we think are the most burning issues right now that we have to deal with? And who should be invited to such a process?
Thank you. Warren?
I think for me the burning question is How do you deal with power and conflict and these competing agendas and processes to try and realize justices?
My question would be, how do you ensure that the public sector and the political agenda do not conflict with each other, so that you can be able to have the two moving towards a scenario where you can be able to have justice and inclusivity?
Great, thank you. All three actually shared the trait of thinking about who gets to pose the questions and who gets to frame injustice, and how do we pull a variety of people to deal with the power relations, the very complex and conflicting power relations around justice and realizing justices. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, panelists, for a very engaging discussion. And I believe lunch is going to be over there. Right? Thank you.
Thank you.